It was the sort of afternoon that seemed borrowed from a postcard. Sunlight soft as cream, lilacs bending under the weight of their own fragrance, and the genteel chatter of the St. Mary Mead Ladies' Garden Society fluttering over cups of tea. The annual charity garden party at Colonel and Mrs. Harrington's estate was, as always, the event of the season. An opportunity to show off not just one's roses, but one's refinement. Miss Jane Marple, sitting quietly in a wicker chair near the edge of the lawn, appeared entirely content to be forgotten. Dressed in pale lavender and a sensible hat, she stirred her tea absently, her blue eyes moving from one guest to another with mild interest, the way one might observe the habits of sparrows. To the casual eye, the party was a pleasant affair. Mrs. Harrington fluttered about, her laughter tinkling as she fussed over cucumber sandwiches. Reverend Tapping and his formidable wife presided near the trestle tables of sponge cake and seed loaf, and young men in crisp summer jackets helped the elderly navigate the gravel paths. But beneath the small talk and civility, Miss Marple sensed the hum of unease, the faint, discordant note that often preceded trouble in such peaceful places. It was, perhaps, the arrival of Mr. Lionel Nash that set it vibrating. He was a newcomer to the village, a charming, silver-haired man who had taken the old bishop's cottage near the green. His manners were impeccable, his smile warm. Yet there was something faintly rehearsed in the way he greeted people, something too polished to belong to a man entirely at ease. "He's a widower, you know," whispered Mrs. Bantry to Miss Marple, sotto voce. "Came down from London after some financial unpleasantness, though one can never be sure what that means, can one?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, people rarely leave London for the countryside, unless they're running away from something, or toward something," she murmured. The string quartet had just begun a lilting waltz when a commotion stirred near the marquee. Mrs. Harrington's maid, Alice, came running, pale as the linen tablecloths. "It's Mr. Nash," she gasped. "In the library. Oh, someone must come quickly." Within moments, the jovial harmony of the garden dissolved into a murmur of alarm. The guests pressed toward the great French doors of the house, where Colonel Harrington, red-faced and puffing, was already striding inside. Miss Marple rose more slowly, setting down her teacup. The tremor of excitement that rippled through the crowd did not touch her. She simply adjusted her gloves and followed, her expression one of quiet concern. In the cool dimness of the library, Mr. Lionel Nash lay slumped beside the great oak writing desk. His pocket watch, curiously, had fallen to the carpet, its glass cracked and its hands fixed firmly at 9 o'clock. Colonel Harrington's voice boomed. "Fetch Dr. Hayward at once. The man's dead." Few gasps filled the air. Mrs. Bantry clutched at Miss Marple's arm. How dreadful, at such a lovely party. Miss Marple's gaze drifted from the lifeless figure to the mantel clock, which ticked on, serenely indifferent. She noted the half-finished letter on the desk, a faint scent of tobacco, and a small smear of something dark, perhaps ink, on the man's right cuff. "Curious," she said softly. "Very curious indeed." The clock on the mantel continued its rhythm, steady and untroubled, as if time itself refused to acknowledge the interruption. But the clock on the floor, stopped at precisely 9, would soon prove the truest witness of all. Mrs. Harrington's voice, usually so buoyant, fell to a brittle whisper as she hovered near the library door, directing people back to the lawn with a flurry of nervous gestures. The quartet had stopped mid-bar, bows suspended as if petrified, and the guests dispersed in a slow, murmuring drift like leaves reluctant to accept the coming wind. Inside, Colonel Harrington fussed about, knocking an empty inkstand with a clumsy elbow and swearing under his breath, while Miss Marple took a quiet step closer to the desk, her glance calm and unhurried. Dr. Hayward arrived in brief, efficient strides, case clacking softly against his knee. He bent to the body and did the necessary things with a doctor's practical dignity. Watch checked, eyelids lifted, the faintest scent near the lips considered. "Heart," suggested Colonel Harrington, hopeful, as though it might absolve the party. The doctor's head tilted. "Perhaps," he said, non-committal, "but I'll not certify anything yet. He's been dead not very long." He looked toward the cracked pocket watch on the carpet, its small hands frozen at 9. Curious, that. Miss Marple, who had known dozens of clocks, parish, mantle, carriage, and human, simply inclined her head. "Curious," she echoed. "They are sometimes loyal to sentiment, clocks, but rarely to truth." She let her eyes rest on the half-finished letter. The pen lay nearby, its nib glistening, and a faint, interrupted flourish marked where the line had broken. Neat handwriting, controlled, a man who liked balance and careful statements. The paper bore the crest of the county club, borrowed, perhaps, from a stationery drawer or brought along out of habit. A thin crease along the top spoke of a hankering to fold, then a change of mind. She noticed the ashtray, meticulously clean except for 2 pale flakes and a thin smear, rubbed as if by an impatient thumb. The air carried a polite, genteel tobacco, not the sort one associates with boys trying to be men, but something discreet, expensive, almost scented. "Best to close off this room," Dr. Hayward said finally, rising, and his gaze settled briefly on Miss Marple with the faintest suggestion that he knew she was seeing more than she admitted. "The inspector will want it as it is." They drifted back onto the terrace, where the relief of sunlight and lilac greeted them like a friend who did not wish to know too much. Conversation resumed in earnest now, because people must speak when they are uneasy, and in villages they must speak together. Mrs. Bantry, fluttering, reported to a small semicircle of ladies that Mr. Nash had been rather pale earlier. Hadn't she noticed how he'd refused the sponge cake? Mrs. Hartley Riggs pronounced that men from London were susceptible to shocks. It was the tramways and the nervous rushing about. A younger woman, Miss Phyllis Green, who taught elocution and was admiringly efficient, said she'd seen Mr. Nash speaking very earnestly with Reverend Tapping under the yew hedge before luncheon. "Raised voices, I thought," she added, eyes bright with the righteousness of careful listening. Reverend Tapping approached for confirmation, flushed in a most unclerical manner, and tugged at his collar. "We were discussing the Restoration Fund," he said shortly. Mr. Nash had an alternative view of generosity. His wife, formidable Mrs. Tapping, inserted herself with the smoothness of a seasoned general. Lionel, Mr. Nash, was a man who liked to appear charitable in ways that could be noticed, she said. "There is sometimes a difference between the widow's mite and a theatrical benefaction. That is all." She did not add that she disliked theatricals unless she directed them. Miss Marple folded her hands, listening as one listens to a distant bell. The remarks were not yet useful, but their tones were. A discrepant note glinted within them like a thread of darker silk woven into a bright fabric. An unfinished quarrel, a pocket of embarrassment, pride disguised as moral judgment. She had once known a young man in the village who was forever taking the credit for gifts his old aunt paid for. Mr. Nash did not quite resemble him, but he had that same veneer of polish that scuffed when one looked too steadily. When Inspector Cray arrived from Much Benham, a square-shouldered, sandy-haired man with a steady, courteous manner and a patience that did him credit, the garden party took on the reliability of officialdom. He spoke first with Dr. Hayward, then with the Harringtons, then with the maid Alice, whose voice wobbled as she explained she'd gone into the library to fetch a fresh box of notepaper for Mrs. Harrington's donation list, and found Mr. Nash gone all grey, which seemed to her quite wrong for someone so neatly dressed. The inspector's pencil ticked over his notebook as he asked the tolerable questions. No one had seen Mr. Nash go inside alone. Had anyone been with him? Who had laughed near the French doors at 5 minutes to 4? At which point, a startled boy in a blazer accused a girl in a pink dress of laughing at a dog. and the girl accused the boy of stepping on her toe, and time, which people remembered badly at the best of times, knotted itself as it always did. Miss Marple walked a small loop about the terrace, her gaze returning once to the French doors. The library's rug was a greenish thing with a discreet pattern, one that would hide dust and accidental ash quite well. The corridor beyond, however, bore a runner of a lighter shade. If someone had come hurriedly away, she noticed a faint, interrupted trace near the skirting. Not a mark, precisely, but the suggestion that a smear had been hurriedly blotted. She did not go closer. One must allow policemen their pleasures, and Inspector Cray looked like a man who enjoyed finding things for himself. Presently, Mrs. Bantry returned to Miss Marple with a confidence that had grown richer for being repeated 3 times. "They say Mr. Nash was writing a letter," she announced. "To whom, nobody knows. Might have been a confession." "People rarely confess in letters unless they wish to be found out," said Miss Marple mildly. "And those who truly wish to be found out don't always choose so neat a stationery." Mrs. Bantry blinked, decided that was clever, and assumed agreement. "And Alice says he wore gloves all afternoon, yet he was without them in the library. Surely that's suspicious." "That depends," Miss Marple said, "on whether gloves are worn to conceal or to declare. There is a great deal one can say with gloves." Inspector Cray, having made his initial rounds, approached Miss Marple with the careful deference local police often showed to local propriety. "Miss Marple," he said, "I hope you'll forgive me, but you have a way of noticing what others pass by. Did you observe anything amiss?" It was spoken lightly, but his eyes were serious. "1 or 2 small oddities," Miss Marple allowed. "The stopped watch, for instance, which is always dramatic but rarely accurate, and the letter that wished to be folded but was not, and the library's ashtray, which was cleaned in a hurry by someone who does not usually clean ashtrays. There is also a certain scent of tobacco that does not belong to Colonel Harrington, who smokes a stouter sort, nor to the Reverend, who does not smoke at all in public, and Mr. Nash's cuff, an impatient smear that is perhaps not ink." She paused. "But it is early to say anything, Inspector. People do the oddest things for the simplest reasons." He absorbed this with a slow nod, a man placing small marbles into compartments. "We'll keep the room sealed and have a look at that ash. I should think," Miss Marple added gently, "that you'll want to know who Mr. Nash expected at 9. "At 9, he repeated, surprised. She inclined her head toward the memory of the cracked watch. If a man is interrupted at his writing, and his watch breaks at an hour he did not share, one wonders whether the hour mattered to him or to someone else. In villages, appointments are not always written down. The inspector gave a rueful smile. "You speak like a book, Miss Marple." "Oh no," she said mildly. "Books are far more orderly." Word of Lionel Nash's death spread by supper time in the manner of all village knowledge, a circular motion that still managed to arrive at the center. By evening, the Blue Boar saw a profitable rise in whispered speculation. Mr. Pritchard declared it poison. It was always poison in his view, and preferably foreign. Mrs. Hartley Riggs suggested the London scandal had followed Mr. Nash here. She did not specify which scandal, for the beauty of a scandal is how obligingly it changes shape to fit the listener. Miss Phyllis Green, who had a taste for drama, stated that Mr. Nash had been blackmailing someone. One could tell from the way he bowed. A mysterious bow, she said, signified a hold over others. Miss Marple, at her cottage, fed her canary and looked at the fading evening light. The cottage clock ticked its honest tick. In the quiet, she considered her memories of the afternoon as one lays out familiar knitting on one's lap, counting the rows. He'd been scrupulous, Lionel Nash. Scrupulous or eager to appear so. A man who made careful impressions and was disappointed when they were not admired sufficiently. And yet there was something else. The faint line at his mouth when Mrs. Harrington praised him too publicly, as if the attention felt like a bargain raised beyond its price. She had known a grocer once who kept a ledger of kindnesses owed to him, and in the end it was not a missing sum that ruined him, but a remark he could not bear. Men and women alike can suffer when gratitude comes dressed as command. She set aside the thought, just as a soft tapping came at the door. It was Alice, the maid, eyes still wide above a damp handkerchief. "Miss Marple," she whispered, "begging your pardon for coming, but may I tell you something? I didn't say it to the inspector because it sounded silly, but when I found Mr. Nash, the mantel clock had just chimed the quarter, and yet the French doors, they were ajar, not wide, but as if someone forgot which way they'd gone. And there was a smell, like oranges, very faint, though no oranges were served at tea. It made me think of Christmas time, and I don't know why." Miss Marple took her hand gently. "My dear," she said, "you have told me something very useful indeed." Miss Marple thanked Alice gently and sent her home with a few soft-spoken reassurances. When the door closed, the little cottage returned to its natural quiet. The steady tick of the clock, the distant bark of a dog somewhere near the green, the soft settling of the evening air. Yet within that quiet, Miss Marple's mind was anything but still. The smell of oranges. It lingered oddly, like an echo of something not yet understood. She sat for a while, her hands folded over her knitting, the pattern untouched. A faint citrus scent was, in itself, nothing unusual. Colognes and cleaning oils carried it often enough, but the absence of oranges at the party, that was peculiar. And peculiarities, Miss Marple knew well, were the first threads one tugged when unraveling human mischief. The next morning dawned in a gauzy mist, the sort that softened hedgerows and made the roofs of St. Mary Mead glisten like the scales of some patient creature waking. The church bell tolled 8, and by past, the village was once again humming with purpose. Milk deliveries, washing hung to dry, postmen exchanging solemn opinions about the state of the world. Yet beneath all the usual business, the talk of Lionel Nash's death threaded itself through every conversation, as if each word must brush against it to feel complete. Miss Marple, walking with her small wicker basket to the grocer's, found that she was expected to know more than anyone. Mrs. Hartley Riggs intercepted her near the post office with a voice brimming with importance. "My dear Miss Marple, I simply must tell you, I heard that the doctor is keeping very quiet about Mr. Nash's condition. They say he found something under the fingernails. Poison, perhaps. Digitalis, I should think. The heart, you know." She leaned in with theatrical discretion. "And that business with the watch, surely it means the poor man was trying to send a message?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "One must be cautious with messages from the dead," she said. "They so often turn out to have been written by the living." Mrs. Hartley Riggs blinked at her, uncertain whether that was agreement or rebuke, and bustled off toward the butcher's. Miss Marple continued her way down the lane, her basket swinging lightly. She stopped briefly by the churchyard gate, where the Reverend Tapping stood speaking to Inspector Cray. Their conversation carried the careful politeness of men at cross purposes. When the inspector tipped his hat to Miss Marple, she saw the faintest shadow of fatigue beneath his courtesy. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said. "Dr. Hayward's given me his preliminary view. Sudden heart failure, though he's not satisfied. There's no sign of a struggle, but we'll have to wait for the analysis. The coroner will want to be certain." "And Mr. Nash's affairs?" Miss Marple asked mildly. "Have you found any letters of significance?" "Nothing obvious," the inspector replied. "The half-written note you saw seems to have been addressed to the vicarage. Though it's peculiar. There's only the salutation, 'My dear Reverend,' and not another word before the pen stopped. I suppose he was interrupted." The Reverend's face took on an uncomfortable shade of crimson. "He wished to contribute to the church fund," he said stiffly. There was some disagreement about the manner of it. "I regret if I spoke sharply, but I assure you, Inspector, that conversation had ended quite peacefully." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Oh, I'm sure it had," she said in the tone of someone who understood that peace often comes to rest upon the very edge of quarrel. "I recall," she added, "that Mr. Nash was a man who liked to be admired for his good works. Some people prefer their virtue framed, don't they?" The vicar's wife, Mrs. Tapping, appeared then, bearing a basket of flowers for the church altar, and a look that suggested she had overheard just enough to form a firm opinion. "Miss Marple," she said, her tone sweet but sharpened at the corners, "you are always so observant. Tell me, did you notice whether Mr. Nash seemed agitated before the incident? I could not help but think he looked most unwell." Miss Marple shook her head. "No more than a man might who has something on his conscience, or perhaps something in his pocket that troubles him." Mrs. Tapping stiffened slightly, then composed herself with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "How philosophical of you, dear Miss Marple," she said, and went on her way toward the nave. The inspector watched her go, then lowered his voice. "It's my belief, Miss Marple, that Mr. Nash had an appointment that afternoon, someone he expected in the library. No one admits to being that person, of course, but these things come out in time." "They do," Miss Marple said softly, "though sometimes the person expected is not the one who arrives." He frowned thoughtfully, then excused himself to attend to the coroner's arrangements, leaving Miss Marple by the gate. She lingered for a moment, looking across the churchyard. The mist was thinning now, and sunlight began to pick out the lettering on the old stones. Names, she knew, each with its story. In a place like St. Mary Mead, stories were the truest fossils of all. When she reached the grocer's, she found the young shop-girl, Dora, whispering to Mrs. Price Ridley, who stood like a sentinel by the shelves of flour. "He bought it himself, miss," Dora was saying in hushed awe. "The day before yesterday, a whole tin of that imported blend. Smells ever so sweet, like flowers and lemons. Mr. Nash said he'd used it in London." Miss Marple's ears pricked. "You're speaking of tobacco, dear?" "Yes, Miss Marple. Lovely scent, but it makes me sneeze. He said it reminded him of happy days." Dora blushed, as if happiness were indecent to mention in a murder case. Miss Marple purchased her tea, offered a pleasant word, and stepped out once more into the brightening morning. The scent of that tobacco, as flowery, citrus, faintly perfumed, might well have been what Alice had mistaken for oranges. That, at least, fit neatly into place. What remained curious was why Mr. Nash, who prized appearances, would have smoked alone in his host's library during a garden party. That was not the act of a man at ease. It was the act of someone expecting a meeting of confidence, private and perhaps not entirely honorable. At home again, she found Dr. Hayward waiting by her gate. He was a tall man with tired eyes, but a sense of humor that crept through his seriousness like sunlight through shutters. "I've had a word with Cray," he said without preamble. "Between you and me, Jane, there's no sign of poison. Heart failure's possible. Yes, but there's an odd discoloration about the lips, something I can't quite place. And there's this." He drew from his coat pocket a small square of folded paper, sealed in a wax envelope. "We found it in his waistcoat pocket. A theatre ticket. London, the Corinthian Playhouse, for last Thursday evening." Miss Marple considered the envelope. "Curious," she said. "He told Mrs. Bantry he had been in Bath that day. I suppose he could have been both, but not without effort." Dr. Hayward sighed. "That's just it. The ticket was torn, it's been used. So he was in London last Thursday, whatever tale he told. And I fancy that might matter, because the Corinthian is not a theatre one attends alone. He might have met someone there, perhaps someone who didn't wish to remain in his story." Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her mind was brisk. Theatre tickets, sweet tobacco, an interrupted letter, and a watch stopped at 9, she murmured. "I wonder, Doctor, how many performances one man can play before the curtain falls of its own accord." That evening, as dusk folded over St. Mary Mead, she sat once more by her lamp, knitting needles clicking faintly while the world beyond her window dimmed to lavender. Her mind turned over the facts like smooth stones in the palm. The watch fixed at 9, the faint scent of citrus, the appointment that no one claimed. Somewhere within those small details lay the truth. Not a truth of great drama, perhaps, but the quiet, stubborn sort that grows from human folly. And folly, she knew better than anyone, was as old as time and twice as punctual. The next morning broke bright and cold, the sort of October day that sharpened the outlines of every cottage roof and left a silvery sheen upon the hedgerows. Miss Marple rose early, stirred the fire to life, and read the small column in the morning paper that briefly mentioned the tragic death at St. Mary Mead Garden party. The piece was polite and vague. Heart failure suspected, a gentleman recently of London society, the community much distressed. The lack of detail was almost comforting. Sensationalism was rare in their little village. Still, Miss Marple knew that silence in print only meant conversation elsewhere. By 9:30, her prediction proved correct. Mrs. Bantry arrived unannounced, bustling in with a scarf askew and the unmistakable gleam of village news in her eyes. "My dear Jane," she began without preamble, "I've just come from the Harringtons. They're in an absolute state. Colonel Harrington is furious that the inspector insists on keeping the library sealed, and Mrs. Harrington is quite beside herself about the scandal, says she'll never host another garden party as long as she lives." Miss Marple smiled faintly, pouring tea with a steadiness that seemed to calm the room. "People do say that every year," she murmured, "though they generally recover in time for the next season's roses." Mrs. Bantry barely noticed. And the strangest thing, apparently, someone telephoned for Mr. Nash the evening before the party. The maid at the cottage said the call came around 9 o'clock. She didn't know the voice, but she said it sounded female, very polished and rather impatient. Now, doesn't that seem odd to you? "Most things are odd if one looks closely," Miss Marple replied. "Particularly telephone calls. They often reveal more of tone than of truth." Still, that detail slotted neatly into place beside the stopped watch. 9 o'clock again. Coincidence, perhaps, or perhaps not. She made a small mental note, the kind she never wrote down, preferring the quiet security of memory to any paper trail. By midday, Inspector Cray appeared at her garden gate, looking as though the morning had already stretched long. He accepted a cup of tea with gratitude and stood for a moment in the little sitting room that smelled faintly of lavender polish and hearth smoke. "You always keep the best tea, Miss Marple," he said with a tired smile. "Better than the station house, I'll tell you that." "It helps the thinking," she said simply. "And thinking is what you'll be doing, I imagine." He sighed, settling his cap on the table. "Dr. Hayward's finished the post-mortem. It's not poison, no trace of anything. The heart did give out, but there's something queer about it. He says it might have been brought on by shock, a sudden fright, or an intense emotion. No marks on him, no struggle, and no sign of forced entry. If I didn't know better, I'd call it natural." "But you do know better," Miss Marple said softly. He nodded. "I do. There's too much that doesn't fit. That letter, for instance. Half-written, no ink blot, no haste, as if he meant to stop just there. And the pocket watch. Someone's gone to the trouble of cracking it, then setting it down neatly. It's not the way things fall." Miss Marple's eyes rested on the fire. "No," she agreed. "It's the way things are arranged." Cray gave her a sidelong glance. "You think it was staged, then, to make it look like something else?" "I think," she said after a pause, "that we're meant to believe 9 o'clock mattered to Mr. Nash, but perhaps it mattered to someone else. That's the trouble with false clocks. They rarely tell us whose time they're keeping." The inspector left soon after, thanking her again, though his brow was furrowed as he went down the lane. Miss Marple watched him from the window until he disappeared round the bend, then returned to her chair and her knitting, though her mind was miles from the pattern. The theatre ticket, the scented tobacco, the letter to the vicarage, The call at 9. All seemed disconnected, yet she had the sense of a shape beneath them, something forming slowly, like a photograph in its tray. That afternoon, she took a slow walk through the village, ostensibly to post a letter, but in truth to observe the subtle hum of gossip. Near the green, she came upon Phyllis Green arranging chrysanthemums outside the schoolhouse, her youthful eagerness dampened only slightly by solemn curiosity. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said bright-eyed, "isn't it dreadful about Mr. Nash? They say he was frightfully rich once, but lost it all in some business with a partner. I do think people from London bring such drama with them. Here, we only ever have trouble about allotments or flower competitions." "Quite," said Miss Marple kindly. "And yet, trouble does have a way of disguising itself as ordinary life, doesn't it? A quarrel about flowers may conceal quite as much bitterness as one about fortune." Phyllis laughed, unsure whether it was a joke. "Well, I don't suppose we'll ever know the whole story, though Mrs. Tapping says he was on the verge of a donation to the church and then suddenly changed his mind. I wonder why." "So do I," Miss Marple murmured. At that very moment, a shadow fell across them. The Reverend Tapping himself, looking flustered and rather red-faced. "Good afternoon, Miss Green, Miss Marple," he said quickly. "I was just on my way to the vicarage. We've been rather inundated with inquiries since the event. Terribly distressing." His eyes darted briefly toward Miss Marple. "I trust you won't take too seriously anything you may hear. Poor Mr. Nash was a complex man, that's all. And yet simplicity is often the best disguise," Miss Marple said gently. "I do hope your correspondence remains undisturbed. One hears such tales of letters going astray." He hesitated, just a fraction of a second too long, then smiled tightly. "Indeed. Well, good day to you." He moved off briskly, almost as though escaping. Miss Marple watched him go, her gaze thoughtful. There had been something in his reaction, an unease that went beyond mere embarrassment. The Reverend, she recalled, was meticulous about propriety, but not especially strong under pressure. A man of conscience, yes, but also of pride. Pride, she had often noted, could drive people to astonishing follies when they believed themselves in the right. As she turned to make her way home, a light drizzle began to fall, soft as breath. By the time she reached her cottage, dusk was descending early, the clouds turning the village roofs to shades of pewter. She lit her lamp, the room instantly warm with amber glow. On the mantel, the little clock chimed 6, a modest, honest sound. She listened to it with quiet satisfaction. Clocks, after all, were truthful things unless tampered with. Just as she was settling down, a knock came at the door. When she opened it, Alice stood there again, wringing her hands in her apron. "Oh, Miss Marple, I'm sorry to trouble you," she said. "It's only— the inspector came to the cottage just now, and he asked about the telephone call. I said what I knew, but then, after he left, I remembered Mr. Nash wrote something down after that call, on the little pad by the telephone. I didn't think of it before. I went to look, and it's gone, the whole page torn out." Miss Marple's eyes brightened with the quiet intensity of a hunter sighting movement in the hedgerow. "Gone, you say?" "Yes, miss, and I know it was there yesterday morning because I dusted the table and I saw his writing. Just the number 9 and the letter H, or maybe it was an N, but now the page is missing." Miss Marple thanked her gravely and closed the door. She stood for a long moment in the stillness of her little sitting room, the rain whispering against the window panes. A telephone message written down, then torn away. A watch stopped at 9. A call at 9 from a woman's voice. "Ah," she murmured softly to herself. "So that's where the trail begins. Not with death, but with expectation." Her knitting lay untouched as the evening deepened and the fire burned low. Outside, the church bell marked 7 o'clock, and in that measured sound, Miss Marple heard what others could not, a rhythm of deceit, ticking steadily toward revelation. That night, the wind turned restless over St. Mary Mead. sweeping through the chimneys and rattling the window panes as though the village itself were whispering secrets. Miss Marple sat by her fire a long while after the church clock had struck 10, her knitting idle in her lap, her thoughts circling that missing telephone note. People often believed that clues arrived like signposts, clear, directional, but in her long experience, the truth came softly, in repetitions. The number 9, appearing again and again, the cracked watch, the hour of the phone call, the fragment on the missing page. Coincidence was rarely so consistent. She rose and went to her writing desk, taking out a small notebook. Though she rarely wrote her deductions, she did allow herself the comfort of questions. She wrote 3. Who was the caller? Why 9? Whose fear caused the heart to fail? Then she closed it gently and went to bed, where sleep came fitfully, crowded by images of ticking clocks and faint citrus smoke. Morning brought a kind of uneasy brightness. The news of the missing note had spread already, though Miss Marple couldn't imagine how information in St. Mary Mead was as porous as the hedges that lined its lanes. By breakfast, Mrs. Price Ridley was informing anyone who would listen at the bakery that the maid found new evidence and that Miss Marple is working with the police, a statement both exaggerated and entirely believable to those who knew the old lady's quiet reputation. At 10, Inspector Cray called again, his manner brisk but with the faint air of a man who'd been outpaced by gossip. "Miss Marple," he said as she let him in, "you've a way of knowing things before they're told. So perhaps you'll tell me how half the village heard about that missing note before I'd even finished my breakfast." Miss Marple smiled apologetically. "Information travels by sympathy, Inspector. You know how cats always seem to appear when milk is poured? Villagers are much the same with secrets." He huffed a small laugh despite himself, then grew serious. "I went over the cottage again this morning. You were right, the pad by the telephone is missing a page. We lifted a faint impression from the one beneath it. It looks like a capital N or possibly an H followed by a dash. Could be the start of a name or an abbreviation. There's no local number matching it. And the operator can't recall the call. It came through the exchange at Much Benham, but that's all we've got." Miss Marple poured him tea, thinking. "People often abbreviate when they're nervous," she said, "and it's curious that he wrote it at all. A man writing a number he already knew. Well, that suggests the caller was not a friend." Cray nodded slowly. "We're tracing what friends he had. There's not much. The solicitor in London says his finances were complicated. He'd been drawing small sums recently, enough to suggest someone was pressing him, but not enough to call blackmail, at least not yet. That depends on the sort of man he was," Miss Marple murmured. "Some people pay a little at a time because they hope the world will forget them between installments." They drank in thoughtful silence for a while. Then Miss Marple asked, "And the watch? You said the glass was cracked." "Yes. Odd thing, that. It wasn't dropped. The crack runs across as if struck deliberately. There were faint smudges, perhaps where someone handled it after." "So someone staged his last moment," Miss Marple said softly. "But why 9? If it were meant to deceive, why choose an hour that connects to him? The telephone, the message, the watch. They all insist on it. Perhaps because 9 belonged not to him but to someone else." The inspector regarded her with quiet respect. "You think the killer's mark, then? Something personal?" "Possibly," she said, eyes distant. "Or a reminder. People have a queer way of assigning meaning to times. They mark them as others mark anniversaries." After he'd gone, Miss Marple walked down toward the green. The air smelled of damp leaves and wood smoke. The Harringtons' house stood quiet now, its windows shuttered, though from a distance she could see Mrs. Harrington's figure moving briskly in the garden. Miss Marple hesitated at the gate, then went up the path. The lady of the house greeted her with weary politeness. "My dear Miss Marple, if you've come about, "This dreadful business. I'm afraid there's nothing new to tell you," Mrs. Harrington said, "though I dare say I shall never again invite a stranger to our events. A death at one's own table, quite the scandal." "I'm sure it's been distressing," Miss Marple said kindly. "I only wondered whether Mr. Nash spoke to you the day before the party." Mrs. Harrington frowned, searching her memory. Yes, he did call. He wanted to confirm the time. He said he might bring someone, though he never did. I remember thinking he sounded distracted. Said something about having an appointment first. At 9, I believe. He laughed when I said that was rather early for a garden party. Miss Marple's expression did not change, though her heart gave a small stir. "And he didn't mention who this appointment was with?" "No, just that it was an old acquaintance, I think, but I can't swear to it. You know how one forgets conversations when tragedy intervenes." Miss Marple thanked her gently and took her leave, walking back through the village lanes, her mind unfolding the pattern anew. A meeting at 9, perhaps not that morning, but the evening before. The theatre ticket, London, Thursday. The call from a woman at 9 the night before his death. And then the watch cracked and set to 9. It began to form a chain, fragile but distinct, a meeting that carried into a threat, a warning delivered by telephone, and a final attempt to fix the hour of fear into permanence. That afternoon she called on Dr. Hayward at his surgery, arriving just as he was finishing with a patient. "You'll think me meddlesome," she began, "but I wondered, those slight markings you mentioned on Mr. Nash's lips, could they have come from contact with metal?" He looked thoughtful. "Possibly. A pipe stem, perhaps. Or a cigarette holder. Or a pocket watch," she said quietly. "If it were pressed against his face after death, say to make it appear as though he'd fallen forward upon it." The doctor regarded her, then nodded slowly. "You think someone staged it, then?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "that whoever met Mr. Nash that afternoon wanted very badly to mark the time, to make it seem that something ended exactly when it did, perhaps because it had begun at 9 the night before." As she left the surgery, twilight was gathering over the village, and the first lamps flickered to life. The air smelled faintly again of something sweet and smoky, someone lighting a cigarette down the lane. But to Miss Marple, it was no longer just a smell. It was the ghost of a clue, one that tied the scent of oranges to the memory of a woman's voice and a promise made at precisely 9 o'clock. When she reached her gate, she paused, turning the key slowly. Across the road, the vicarage windows glowed softly, and through the curtains she caught the silhouette of Reverend Tapping bending over his desk. For a brief moment, she thought she saw a second figure standing near him, a slender outline, unmistakably feminine. But then the curtain stirred, and the scene was gone. Miss Marple entered her cottage, her mind perfectly calm. 9 o'clock, she murmured, setting down her gloves. It seems to be everyone's favorite hour. The following morning arrived pale and windless, the air cool with the promise of rain. Miss Marple awoke early, the events of the past few days settling in her mind like the final pieces of a jigsaw, still scattered, yet beginning to hint at a picture. She moved through her morning tasks with habitual quietness, making her tea, feeding the canary, and reading her Bible with the same thoughtful calm she applied to murder. Only when she turned to tidy her writing desk did she pause, her eyes falling on the small notebook where she had written her 3 questions. She studied the first, "Who was the caller?" and tapped the page gently with her pencil. It was, she thought, always the question that appeared simplest which proved the most treacherous. By mid-morning, the expected knock came at the door. Inspector Cray stood there, hat in hand, looking faintly exasperated and faintly amused. "I've had a long chat with the Reverend Tapping this morning," he began as Miss Marple ushered him in. "Seems Mr. Nash had offered him a sizable donation to the church fund, £500, no small sum. But the money was never paid. The Reverend says Nash changed his mind at the last moment." Miss Marple poured tea with her usual precision. "A sudden change of heart can be a curious thing," she said mildly, "especially in men who enjoy being admired for their generosity." "True enough," Cray admitted, sitting. "But here's where it turns strange. The solicitor in London says Nash did withdraw £500 from his account 2 days before his death. No trace of where it went, and the Reverend swears he never received it." Miss Marple nodded, unsurprised. Then someone else must have. Perhaps the Reverend was meant to believe he had been spared embarrassment. Or perhaps the gift went to a different kind of church altogether, one without hymns but plenty of confessions. Cray smiled thinly. "You mean blackmail?" "I mean human nature," she replied. "Money given in fear often travels faster than money given in faith." He leaned forward. "You really think he was being blackmailed?" "I think he was being handled, Inspector. Possibly by someone who knew him well enough to make it seem a moral obligation. Those are the most dangerous debts of all." Cray's eyes narrowed slightly. "And the caller? You still think the woman who phoned him at 9 was involved?" "I think," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "that her voice frightened him, enough that he wrote it down, enough that his heart, already tired, I suspect, had begun to fail him long before the final shock came." Cray stood, restless now. "Well, we'll find out soon enough. There's been a report from London. A woman named Mrs. Evelyn Nash claims to be his late brother's widow. She's coming down this afternoon to identify the body and settle some papers." Miss Marple's eyes brightened. "Ah, a widow twice connected. I imagine she'll know more than she intends to tell." When Mrs. Evelyn Nash arrived later that day, all of St. Mary Mead took notice. She was not what the villagers expected. Tall, composed, and dressed in mourning black that suited her too well to be purely dutiful. She carried herself with the practiced grace of someone accustomed to scrutiny. Miss Marple, standing with Mrs. Bantry near the churchyard gate, watched her alight from the hired motor car. Her expression was one of polite observation, though behind her calm eyes she was already examining details. The faint scent of perfume that drifted in the air, a sweetness edged with citrus. The narrow black gloves fitted too perfectly to be new. The way the woman's gaze flicked toward the vicarage before turning deliberately away. "Quite striking, isn't she?" murmured Mrs. Bantry. "Not at all the grieving type, if you ask me." "She grieves for something," Miss Marple said quietly, "though not, I think, for him." Later, Miss Marple contrived to encounter her near the post office, where Mrs. Nash was speaking with Inspector Cray. "Oh, Inspector," the woman was saying, her tone brisk but not unkind. "Lionel was a foolish man in many ways, but hardly wicked. He loved appearances, that was his downfall, and sentimentality, oh, how he indulged it. He told me once he would rather be admired than loved. I suppose that's what killed him in the end." "Admiration is a dangerous diet," Miss Marple observed pleasantly as she passed. Mrs. Nash turned sharply, startled, and then gave a small, assessing smile. "Quite so," she said. "You must be Miss Marple. I've heard you're something of an observer yourself." "Only of people," Miss Marple replied. "Flowers are much simpler." For a moment their eyes met. Two women separated by age and temperament, yet connected by the unspoken knowledge that both understood far more than they said. Mrs. Nash excused herself soon after, but not before Miss Marple caught the faintest trace of the same perfume Alice had described, the scent that had lingered in the library. Orange blossom, sweet, faint, unforgettable. That evening, after the village had settled into its familiar hush, Miss Marple sat by her fire again, her thoughts circling the new arrival. Mrs. Nash had come to claim more than her late brother-in-law's effects. She had come to control the narrative. There was power in how she spoke of the dead man, affection without intimacy, pity without sorrow. And there had been a peculiar defensiveness when she mentioned London, a tightening of the lips as if she feared what might follow. She was still considering this when the clock struck 9. The sound filled the little cottage with quiet insistence, and Miss Marple felt the familiar thrill that came when coincidence became certainty. 9 again. The hour of the call, the hour on the watch, the hour when the threads of this story had first begun to tangle. She rose, took her shawl, and stepped out into the cool night air. The village lay silent under a low mist, the lamps glowing softly through the haze. As she passed the vicarage, she noticed a flicker of light in the study window. Curious, she drew closer. The curtain was half drawn, and through the gap she could see the Reverend Tapping pacing the room, his hands clasped tightly before him. On the desk lay an envelope. Large, cream-colored, the sort used for personal letters. He paused, stared at it for a long moment, then, with a visible effort, tore it in two and thrust the pieces into the fire. Miss Marple withdrew quietly into the shadows. When she reached her cottage again, she sat down and looked at her little notebook once more. She drew a neat line beneath her first question and wrote, "Caller identified. Mrs. Evelyn Nash." Then, under the second, "Why 9? Because it began then. Because it was meant to end then." As she set her pencil down, the clock on her mantelpiece ticked with steady calm. Miss Marple smiled faintly at it. "You keep better time than most people," she said. "But I think before long we shall have to stop you too, at precisely 9. Rain came the next morning, soft but persistent, blurring the rooftops of St. Mary Mead into a watercolor haze. The village looked subdued, as though the grey light had drained it of its usual gossiping energy. Yet Miss Marple knew well that quiet weather rarely stilled tongues. It merely sent them indoors to whisper more comfortably. She rose early, her thoughts precise and calm despite the dull ache of unease that had taken root in her chest. Something about Mrs. Nash's arrival the day before had left her with the unmistakable scent of unfinished business, sharper even than the perfume that lingered in the woman's wake. By 10 o'clock, she had her umbrella in hand and was on her way to the vicarage. The lane was slick with rain, and her sensible shoes made faint, steady sounds against the wet earth. She had not intended to intrude, but the image of the Reverend Tapping burning that envelope haunted her. The Reverend was a good man, she thought, but good men were capable of foolish acts when moral courage met worldly fear. And his wife, Mrs. Tapping, was a woman whose ambition for respectability sometimes strained against her husband's softer conscience. When she arrived, Mrs. Tapping herself answered the door. She was, as always, composed to perfection, though her eyes betrayed a sleepless night. "Miss Marple, do come in out of the wet. I was just making tea," she said, her voice brittle at the edges. "Such dreadful weather, isn't it? I suppose it suits the mood of things." Miss Marple accepted the invitation with a smile. "I've always thought a storm clears the air," she said gently. "Sometimes one finds things more visible afterward." Mrs. Tapping gave a small, constrained laugh. "Indeed, though some things are better left unseen." The sitting room was tidy but unusually tense. The Reverend sat by the fire, a book unopened on his knee, his eyes fixed on the flames. He rose when he saw her, his manner polite but wary. "Miss Marple, I hope you'll forgive us. I can imagine why you've come." Miss Marple sat quietly, folding her umbrella. "Then perhaps it will save me the trouble of saying too much." There was a brief silence. Mrs. Tapping poured tea, her hand trembling ever so slightly as she set down the cup. "If this is about poor Mr. Nash," she began, "we have said all we can to Inspector Cray. I don't see what more there is to add." "On the contrary," said Miss Marple mildly, "I think there's still something missing, and I imagine the Reverend knows what it is." He flinched just perceptibly. "Miss Marple, this is a dreadful business. A man is dead, yes, but I cannot see what more good comes of stirring the matter." "You burned a letter last night," she said softly. "It was addressed to you, I think." "Was it from Mr. Nash?" Mrs. Tapping gasped. "Really, Miss Marple, how dare you?" But the Reverend raised a weary hand. It's no use, Clara. She's right. His voice was heavy with resignation. Yes, Miss Marple, it was from Nash. A letter written before his death. I destroyed it because it was unchristian. The words, the accusations, they would only have caused pain. Accusations, Miss Marple repeated gently. Against whom? The Reverend's face tightened. Against my wife. Mrs. Tapping's teacup clattered into its saucer. Lionel Nash was a liar, she said sharply. He tried to frighten us, to make mischief. He was furious that my husband refused to allow his so-called donation to be used for that ridiculous stained glass project he wanted to dedicate to his late brother. I warned you, Edward, that he was unstable. Miss Marple watched them both, her expression unreadable. And yet, she said softly, he seems to have known something that frightened you both. Something you believed might come to light. Mrs. Tapping turned pale. You have no idea what that man was capable of. Oh, I have a fair idea, Miss Marple said. He was capable of using affection as currency and secrets as collateral. But he was not, I think, a man who frightened easily himself, which makes it interesting that someone else managed to frighten him. Fatally so, it seems. The Reverend sat forward, hands clasped. You think it was murder, then? I think it was fear, she replied. And fear can be very persuasive. It can make a man's heart stop, or another's hand act rashly. She paused, letting the quiet settle before continuing. Tell me, Reverend, did Mr. Nash ever mention a Mrs. Evelyn Nash to you? He blinked. Only once, I believe. He said she was his brother's widow, a woman of, how did he put it, practical sympathies. I took it to mean that she was kind. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Oh, I rather think she is. Practically kind, selectively honest. I met her yesterday, and I dare say she has a very good memory for the past, especially where money and promises are concerned. Mrs. Tapping looked confused now, her earlier composure slipping. Are you saying she— I'm not saying anything yet, Miss Marple said, rising. Only that I believe Mr. Nash had dealings with her more recently than she admits, and that something passed between them. Something worth £500, perhaps. If you should recall anything else, Reverend, I would urge you to tell Inspector Cray. Secrets tend to have a most inconvenient way of unburying themselves. She took her leave before they could protest further, stepping back into the rain which had grown heavier. The path glistened underfoot, and through the mist she could see the faint glow of the Harringtons' lamps beyond the hedgerow. The entire village, it seemed, was quietly holding its breath. As she walked home, Miss Marple reviewed the new pattern forming in her mind. A letter burned, a widow arrived, a donation vanished. The Reverend's guilty tremor had told her enough. Nash's letter must have contained more than mere accusations. It was a warning, or perhaps a demand. And Mrs. Tapping's reaction had not been that of a woman merely defending her husband's good name. It had been the fear of exposure. By the time she reached her cottage, the rain had slowed to a whisper. She lit the fire, made herself tea, and took out her notebook again. Beneath her earlier notes, she wrote, "A letter burned by fear, written to protect another's lie. Evelyn Nash arrived too soon to grieve, too late to warn." She sat back, watching the flames catch and curl. Somewhere beyond the window, a clock chimed the half-hour, muffled by distance. Miss Marple listened to it and smiled faintly to herself. 9:30, she murmured. How very punctual they all are. And in that moment she understood that the truth, whatever it was, had also been waiting for its appointed hour. Only now it was almost ready to strike. The next day began with a thin, silvery light over St. Mary Mead, the kind that made the air feel suspended, quiet before something shifted. The rain had washed the streets clean, leaving puddles that reflected the neat rows of cottages and the slow drift of clouds above. Miss Marple, up earlier than usual, felt that particular stillness that often preceded revelation. She had spent half the night thinking about Reverend Tapping's burnt letter, about Mrs. Evelyn Nash's arrival at precisely the moment suspicion began to scatter, and about the curious habit of the number 9 threading through everything like a thin wire. It was a puzzle she could almost see through if she turned it the right way. By mid-morning, the postman brought a small envelope addressed in unfamiliar handwriting. Inside was a folded note, unsigned but written in a neat, masculine hand. If you truly wish to understand Lionel Nash, speak to the woman who called him a coward. There was no other message, no signature, but Miss Marple could tell at once that it was not the work of a prankster. She turned the paper over, studying the faint watermark. Corinthian Playhouse, London. The theatre ticket found in Nash's pocket. The connection tightened like thread being pulled. She slipped on her coat and set off toward the high street, her thoughts brisk and tidy. At the edge of the village, she met Inspector Cray, who looked harried but determined. "Ah, Miss Marple," he greeted. "I was just coming to see you. The London police have confirmed something rather odd." Lionel Nash wasn't simply attending that play, he had a meeting arranged after it. They've found a name in the theatre's reservation book. A Mrs. Evelyn Nash. Miss Marple's lips curved faintly. "Ah, yes. She does seem to be everywhere at just the right time." "She claims she was never there," Cray said. "Says she hadn't seen Lionel in months. But we've got her signature in the theatre's guest log. The same hand that signed the statement she gave me yesterday." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Then I think, Inspector, that her relationship with Mr. Nash was more than familial, and perhaps more dangerous than she would like you to know." Cray frowned. "Dangerous how?" "Some people," she said, "kill out of passion, others out of pride, but the cleverest kind do it out of preservation." He stared at her for a long moment. "You think she killed him?" "I think she set something in motion. Whether it ended as she meant it to, that's another matter." They walked together toward the post office, where Mrs. Bantry was emerging, clutching her morning letters with the air of one who had already read every line in her head. She stopped when she saw them, her eyes gleaming with the thrill of significance. "Have you heard? Mrs. Nash is staying at the Harringtons now. Poor dear. They say she was dreadfully upset this morning. Something about a telegram." "What sort of telegram?" Cray asked sharply. Mrs. Bantry leaned closer. "No one knows exactly. But Alice, the maid, you know, said she overheard Mrs. Nash say, 'He's found out. It's over now.' Quite dramatic, really." Cray exchanged a look with Miss Marple. "I'll have a word with her," he said grimly, and went on ahead toward the Harringtons' house. Miss Marple lingered by the post office a moment longer, her gaze distant. "He's found out." The phrase echoed, oddly, against the note she'd received that morning. Someone had found something, yes. But what? The Reverend's letter, perhaps? Or the missing page from the telephone pad? The sense of a tightening loop filled her mind. The truth was circling back upon itself, like a clock returning to its appointed hour. By the time she reached the Harringtons' estate, Inspector Cray was already inside, speaking quietly with Mrs. Nash in the drawing-room. Miss Marple waited in the hall until she was called in. The widow looked pale but perfectly composed, her gloved hands resting in her lap, eyes shining like glass. On the table before her lay a crumpled telegram. Cray handed it to Miss Marple. It read simply, "The truth comes out tonight at 9. Miss Marple's fingers closed around the paper. "At 9 again," she murmured. "How very punctual everyone has become." Mrs. Nash's composure wavered. "It's a hoax," she said. "Someone trying to frighten me. Perhaps your villagers, Inspector, find it amusing to torment a grieving woman." Cray said nothing, only watched her steadily. Miss Marple, however, moved closer, her tone gentle. "You're not so easily frightened, Mrs. Nash. But Lionel was. He wrote your initial down the night before he died, didn't he? The letter N, or perhaps H for Harrington. He must have thought it connected to you." Mrs. Nash stood abruptly. "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do," Miss Marple said softly. "You called him at 9 that night. You asked him for money. You told him someone in the village had learned your secret. You may not have meant to kill him, but fear travels faster over the telephone than one expects. And when he died, you came here not to mourn, but to make sure nothing survived him, not his letter, not his payment, not his guilt." The woman's hands tightened against her gloves. For a heartbeat, she seemed to shrink, the poise draining from her like air from a punctured balloon. Then she sank into the chair again, eyes flashing with something between anger and exhaustion. "You think you're clever, Miss Marple," she said quietly. "But you don't understand the kind of man Lionel was. He could charm a vicar's wife out of her pearls and make her think it was charity. He made promises, dozens of them, some in love, some in greed. And when they all began to collide, he wanted me to clean up the mess." Cray leaned forward. "Clean up how?" She laughed bitterly. "He forged my signature on checks, Inspector. I discovered it weeks ago. He swore he'd fix it. Then he said he'd donate to that blasted church to cover his debt. But I knew him. He'd find a way to make me complicit. So I came here to stop him. I called him that night to tell him it was over. If he'd listened, if he'd just let it end, I wouldn't be sitting here now." Her voice trembled on the last word, then hardened again. "You can't prove anything." Miss Marple's tone remained kind. "No, my dear, not yet. But I believe someone else can. Someone who knows what was in that burnt letter." Mrs. Nash's head snapped up. "What letter?" "The one Lionel sent to the Reverend," Miss Marple said quietly. "The one your call made necessary." Cray stood, closing his notebook. "I'll speak to the vicar again. And I think, Mrs. Nash, we'll keep you close by until this evening. 9 o'clock seems to be when your affairs prefer to resolve themselves." She gave a small, trembling smile. "I've nothing left to hide, Inspector." But as Miss Marple looked at her, she saw the flicker of something that betrayed the lie. Not guilt, precisely, but calculation, the look of a woman waiting for someone else to make the next move. Outside, the church bell tolled the hour. Noon, and the sound rolled across the damp fields like a slow warning. Miss Marple turned toward the window, her mind already assembling the next step. 9 o'clock, the telegram had said. Tonight, then, the truth would arrive precisely on time. The afternoon passed with a sense of expectancy that the entire village seemed to feel, though few could have named its cause. The air held that peculiar stillness which comes before a storm, not of weather, but of revelation. Miss Marple, after leaving the Harringtons' estate, walked home through the damp lanes, her umbrella tapping rhythmically against the stones. Her thoughts were clear now, the pieces of the puzzle no longer scattered but circling a single point. The trouble was that the point itself was still shrouded, an act hidden not just by deceit, but by decency. And, she reflected, decency could hide a multitude of crimes. By the time she reached her cottage, the afternoon light had dimmed to the color of pewter. She made tea, though she barely touched it, and sat listening to the faint ticking of her mantel clock. It was nearly 4, 5 hours until 9. She had no doubt the telegram's promise would be kept. The murderer, or perhaps the frightened soul behind all this confusion, had chosen the hour deliberately. It had become a ritual now, that number, repeated until it meant something entirely different from mere time. At 4:30, a firm knock came at her door. It was Inspector Cray again, his coat speckled with drizzle, his expression grave. "Miss Marple," he said, "we've had word from London. The handwriting on that note you received, the one about the woman who called him a coward, matches the Reverend Tapping's. He must have sent it this morning." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Ah, then the Reverend has decided that confession is preferable to exposure." Cray frowned. "You think he's involved?" "Not in the death, Inspector. But he's complicit in the truth. There's something he knows, something that connects Lionel Nash, Mrs. Evelyn Nash, and perhaps even his own wife." Cray exhaled. I've spoken to him. Twice today. He's nervous, yes, but he swears he's told me everything. People often swear that, Miss Marple said mildly, when they've only told what they can bear to repeat aloud. Cray studied her for a moment, then nodded. He's asked me to meet him at the church tonight, said he'll hand over whatever he's been keeping. 9 o'clock. Miss Marple gave a small, knowing smile. Of course. Then we shall both attend. As twilight thickened, the village seemed to shrink into itself. Windows glowed softly against the mist, and the scent of damp leaves hung in the air. Miss Marple walked with Cray towards St. Mary's Church, the path slick under their shoes. Neither spoke much. The inspector's lantern threw small circles of gold on the cobblestones ahead, the light wavering like something uncertain of its own strength. When they reached the churchyard, the gates creaked faintly in the wind. Inside, the nave was dim, the candles unlit. Only the faint glimmer from the vestry door suggested occupation. They moved quietly through the aisles, the echo of their steps rising to the vaulted ceiling. Cray pushed the vestry door open and stopped short. The Reverend Tapping stood near the small desk, his face ashen, his hands clasped tightly around a folded sheaf of papers. "Inspector," he said hoarsely, "I hoped you'd come. I didn't wish for this to happen, but I can't keep it anymore." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "You've done the right thing, Reverend. The truth rarely kills. It's the lies that do." He gave a hollow laugh. "You're very forgiving, Miss Marple. I wish my wife were." Cray stepped forward. "What is it you have there?" The Reverend handed over the papers. "Copies," he said. "The originals are already gone. Letters, between Lionel Nash and Mrs. Evelyn Nash. He threatened her. He claimed to have evidence she'd been part of her late husband's financial fraud. Letters she wrote herself years ago. He wanted money to keep them quiet. When she refused, he tried to use the church as a front, offering that donation so his conscience would appear spotless. He told me as much last week." Cray unfolded one of the pages, scanning the lines. The words were clear. Lionel's writing, firm and confident. "I'll meet you at 9 to settle the matter. Bring the money or I'll bring the letters to your brother-in-law, the Reverend." Miss Marple's gaze flicked toward the vicar. So the meeting was arranged for 9, the night before his death. "Yes," the Reverend said. "She came. I saw her leaving as I was locking the vestry that evening. She didn't see me. I didn't know what had passed between them until the next day when his body was found." He looked down, his voice breaking. "He sent me that final letter afterward. It accused my wife of helping him arrange his affairs. He said she'd been paid to burn the originals. I destroyed it. I couldn't bear what it implied." Cray's jaw tightened. "Mrs. Tapping helped him?" Miss Marple interjected softly. "Not helped, Inspector. Protected. She thought she was shielding her husband's reputation, not aiding a crime. But in doing so, she buried the very evidence that proved Mrs. Nash's guilt." A gust of wind rattled the stained glass windows, making the candle flames quiver. The church clock began its slow chime, 1, 2, 3, until it reached 9. At the final stroke, a door creaked open at the far end of the aisle. Mrs. Evelyn Nash stepped into the church, her face ghostly pale beneath her veil. "I suppose you found it all out," she said quietly. I wondered if he'd have the courage. Her gaze moved to the Reverend. "You should have left well enough alone." Cray took a step forward. "Mrs. Nash, you'll come with me. We have your letters now." But she smiled faintly, almost sadly. "You think that matters? Lionel's gone. His heart did the work for me. I never laid a hand on him. I only frightened him, as he frightened me. I told him he'd pay for every lie, and he did. The coward couldn't even face what he'd become." Miss Marple regarded her with quiet compassion. "Fear kills more often than hate, my dear. You used it as your weapon, but it turned back upon him. The clock stopped because he stopped believing he could outrun his own deceit. Mrs. Nash's composure faltered. She looked around the church. The cold stone, the watching faces, and for the first time seemed truly small. "It's over now," she whispered. "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "At last, it is." Outside, the wind rose again, sweeping through the churchyard as though the world itself exhaled. The lantern flickered, and the church bell gave one final tremor before falling still. Cray turned to Miss Marple, his voice low. "You knew she'd come?" "She couldn't bear not to," Miss Marple said. "People who orchestrate fear always wish to see its final result." He nodded slowly, the weight of understanding settling over him. Together they stepped out into the mist, the rain beginning once more in gentle drops. Behind them, the church clock ticked back into motion, its hands passing 9, moving forward again at last. The rain had stopped by the time Miss Marple reached home that night, though the air was still heavy with its scent. Earth, moss, and the faint sweetness of the lilacs stirred by the wind. She closed her door quietly behind her, hung her shawl on its peg, and sat for a long moment in her armchair, letting the stillness of the room settle around her. Outside, the world seemed to pause. No footsteps, no voices, only the slow drip of water from the eaves. The clock on her mantel ticked evenly, a steady rhythm against the silence. For the first time in days, she could think without interruption. It had all ended as she'd known it must, with fear giving way to confession, guilt to resignation. Yet something in the evening's events left her unsatisfied. Evelyn Nash's words, "I only frightened him," had the unmistakable ring of truth, but also of incompleteness. Fear may have stopped Lionel Nash's heart, but fear alone did not stop a watch at precisely 9. Nor did fear write a telegram promising revelation. Someone else, she suspected, had ensured that the hour of reckoning would not go unmarked. The next morning, she awoke to sunlight streaming through lace curtains, pale gold and faintly deceptive. The storm had passed, and St. Mary Mead was already recovering its composure. At the grocer's, people were discussing the case with satisfied finality. Mrs. Bantry declared that it was poetic justice, a man like that dying of his own wickedness. The Reverend Tapping's sermon that day was rumored to be about redemption, though Miss Marple doubted it mentioned letters or deceit. She returned home with her basket, but she could not shake the feeling that the story had not quite ended. The clock on her mantel chimed the quarter hour, and she watched the hands with a faint smile. "You're very good at reminding one when things aren't quite finished," she murmured. Her intuition was confirmed scarcely an hour later when Inspector Cray arrived again, looking unusually grim. "It's a strange business," he said, sitting down heavily. "Mrs. Nash's story holds up. She called him, yes, and the autopsy confirms it was his heart that failed. But the telegram," he pulled a folded slip of paper from his pocket. "It wasn't sent from London. It was sent yesterday morning from the post office here in St. Mary Mead." Miss Marple's eyes lifted. "Then Mrs. Nash didn't write it?" "No, nor did the Reverend. The clerk remembers a woman posting it, but couldn't recall her face clearly. Said she wore gloves, a hat with a veil." He gave a weary shrug. "Half the village dresses that way." Miss Marple was silent for a moment, her thoughts turning back to the night before. The church, the faint sound of footsteps outside the vestry just after 9, the lingering smell of lavender that didn't belong to Mrs. Nash. "Tell me," she said at last, "what of Mrs. Tapping? Was she at home when you went to fetch her husband?" Cray frowned. "She said she was unwell. Didn't attend the service. Why?" "Because," said Miss Marple softly, "she has been trying to finish what her husband could not. She burned one letter to protect him, but when she realized the truth had already escaped her fire, she tried to direct it elsewhere. That telegram was her way of closing the circle. She wanted to ensure that Mrs. Nash's guilt, and not her husband's silence, became the final word." Cray stared at her. "You mean she—" "No, Inspector," Miss Marple interrupted gently. "She did not kill anyone. She only arranged for the final act of judgment to arrive exactly on time. Imagine she believed it a kind of moral service." They went together to the vicarage. The afternoon light filtered through the trees, dappled and soft, almost too serene for what waited ahead. Mrs. Tapping received them in her drawing room, her hands folded, her face composed but pale. "Inspector," she said evenly. "Miss Marple, how can I help you?" Miss Marple's tone was kind, almost conversational. "You've helped already, my dear. The telegram was clever, a final piece to draw Mrs. Nash into the open. You must have known she would come, just as your husband knew he could not live with the truth." For a fleeting instant, Mrs. Tapping's composure cracked. Her breath caught, and her fingers tightened against each other. I only wanted it ended," she whispered. Edward was breaking under the weight of it. That woman, she'd ruined enough lives. Lionel Nash corrupted her, and she in turn corrupted others. I thought if she faced her own fear, it would all be finished. I didn't mean for it to seem cruel." "It wasn't cruelty," Miss Marple said softly. "It was desperation. But you see, fear rarely ends cleanly. It echoes." Tears welled in the woman's eyes. "I thought I was doing right," she said, almost to herself. "For him. For our name." He couldn't bear to see the parish divided. The whispers. Cray sighed. "We won't make it public, Mrs. Tapping. There's no crime in what you did, only poor judgment. The case is closed." When they left the vicarage, the sun was beginning to set, streaking the clouds with muted rose. The village green glowed faintly gold, and the air held that peculiar calm that follows revelation, the moment when people can begin to breathe again. Miss Marple paused at her gate, watching the children playing beyond the hedge, their laughter bright and distant. "Funny thing," Cray said beside her. "After all that cleverness, no one laid a finger on him. He died of fear alone." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, fear is a very physical thing, Inspector. It has killed more hearts than bullets ever have." He nodded, thoughtful. "You'll make my reports sound half like sermons." She chuckled softly. "Only if you write them truthfully." He tipped his hat and walked away down the lane, his figure fading into the soft light. Miss Marple stood for a while longer, then went inside. The room welcomed her with its gentle orderliness, the teacups neatly stacked, the knitting folded where she had left it. On the mantel, the clock ticked with calm precision, its face gleaming in the lamplight. She sat down, hands folded in her lap, eyes half closed. The story, she thought, had ended as such stories often did, not with triumph, but with understanding. The sins that stirred in small villages were no different from those in great cities, only quieter, more deeply buried beneath the courtesies of everyday life. Outside, the church bell tolled 9. Miss Marple looked toward the sound, her expression serene. "There now," she murmured, "right on time." And with that, she poured herself a cup of tea, the steady ticking of the clock marking the peace that follows truth. Delicate, fragile, and, for a time, complete. The following Sunday, the church bells of St. Mary Mead rang clear and bright, untroubled by storm or scandal. The villagers filled the pews once more, their voices rising in familiar hymns. The affair of Lionel Nash had already begun to soften into memory, an odd, tragic story retold in gentle tones over tea, with each telling shaping it into something more palatable. As Miss Marple walked home from the service, she could already hear fragments floating behind her. "A weak heart, poor man," someone said. "A London gentleman, not used to country calm. And Mrs. Nash. A pity, but what a lesson in appearances," added another. Miss Marple smiled faintly to herself. The village, she thought, had returned to its comfortable rhythm as it always did. That was the nature of St. Mary Mead. Its people tucked away their tragedies like pressed flowers between the pages of everyday life. Yet beneath the politeness, something had shifted, just slightly. The Reverend's sermons were gentler now, and Mrs. Tapping's manner softer, as though she had discovered that moral certainty was not the same as righteousness. Even Inspector Cray had taken to visiting from time to time under the pretense of tea, but always with a fresh appreciation for how quiet observation could outpace official method. It was he who came calling that afternoon, his hat in hand and his tone unusually reflective. "I finished my report," he said as Miss Marple poured the tea. "Officially, the cause of death is natural, heart failure under stress. But unofficially, I've written that it was fear that killed him. Not poison, not violence. Fear." Miss Marple nodded, stirring her cup. A fair conclusion. He was a man undone by his own cleverness. He built his life upon falsehoods, and when they began to crumble, he could not bear the sound. Cray sat back, studying her with that half-smile she had come to recognize. "You know, I used to think murder was always about opportunity or rage. But this was quieter, subtler. A web of pride, deceit, and good intentions. Every one of them thought they were doing right." "That," Miss Marple said softly, "is what makes such cases so very sad. Evil rarely announces itself, Inspector. It comes dressed as a kindness or a duty or a favor. People tell themselves they're protecting others when really they're protecting themselves." He nodded thoughtfully. "And the watch, the telegram, all that business about 9 o'clock. It all fit together in the end, didn't it?" "Yes," Miss Marple said. 9 was not the time of his death. It was the hour of his guilt. The meeting that began it all, when he tried to use one person's fear to erase another's. He marked that hour himself, and everything after merely echoed it. The stopped watch, the call, even the telegram, each one a repetition of conscience. It's remarkable how time keeps us honest, Inspector, even when we try to trick it." He smiled. "You make it sound almost poetic." "Oh, I shouldn't," she said, eyes twinkling. "Poetry has too much sympathy for sinners." They shared a quiet moment, the only sound the faint tick of her mantel clock. Then Cray rose, placing his cup carefully on the tray. "Well, I'll leave you to your peace, Miss Marple, though I don't know how you ever find it with all you see." "I find it," she said gently, "because I look. Most people are too afraid to." When he left, she returned to her chair by the window. The late afternoon sun fell across her garden, turning the petals of her roses to soft fire. She watched a sparrow dip into the bird bath, the ripples spreading in perfect circles. It reminded her of human life, how a single action, one whispered threat or quiet deceit, could ripple outward, touching more hearts than one ever meant. She thought of Mrs. Tapping, tending the flowers behind the vicarage now, a little grayer, a little humbler. She thought of Mrs. Nash, who had left the village the day before, saying she could no longer bear the stillness, and she thought of Lionel Nash himself, that polished man who had believed he could control every outcome, until he found that one's conscience keeps its own clock, and it never forgets to chime. The evening light deepened, and she reached for her knitting, her fingers working with steady precision. Outside, the church bell struck the hour. 7. It sounded clear and pure, unburdened at last. Miss Marple smiled faintly as she worked. "Time put right," she murmured. "And people, perhaps, a little so too." When the clock on her mantel ticked over to 9, it did not stop. It carried on as all good clocks do, quiet, exact, and certain, marking the passage of ordinary peace after extraordinary folly. And Miss Marple, calm and content, sipped her tea, the faintest glint of amusement in her eyes. For she knew, as only she could, that in St. Mary Mead the end of one mystery merely marked the beginning of the next.